I told my aunt I could not wait for my sister's wedding next week. She looked at me with pity and said it already happened. Weeks later, that same sister called to borrow my lake house. I said no. My name is Whitney, and at 33 years old, I finally learned that being the family scapegoat only stops when you cut the cord. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a status-obsessed household meant my value was always measured by how well I fit into my mother's perfect picture. My mother, Barbara, treated our family like a public relations firm, where image was the only currency that mattered. If you did not look the part, you were quietly shoved into the background. It was a rainy Tuesday in Seattle when the illusion finally shattered for good. I was enjoying a rare lunch break away from my dual monitors. As an investment strategist, working 60-hour weeks was my normal. I practically lived in tailored black blazers and sensible flats, dedicating every waking moment to building a secure financial future. I had paid off my own student loans by the time I was 28, saved aggressively, and climbed the corporate ladder through sheer grit and late nights. But that afternoon, sitting across from my Aunt Diane at a crowded corner cafe, I was not thinking about market trends, profit margins, or portfolio risks. I was thinking about my younger sister Chelsea and her upcoming wedding. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my phone, eager to show Diane the dress I had finally settled on after weeks of stressful shopping. It was a sophisticated navy blue silk gown, elegant but understated. It was exactly the kind of practical, budget-friendly choice I was known for in my family. I had spent countless evenings scrolling through websites, searching for something that would not clash with Chelsea's extravagant Napa Valley aesthetic, while still fitting my sensible lifestyle. Chelsea was marrying Gavin Prescott, a man whose family practically sweated generational wealth. I knew the wedding was going to be an over-the-top spectacle, and I was terrified of sticking out like a sore thumb. I turned my phone screen toward Diane with a genuine smile on my face. I told her I thought the color would look perfect in the family photos, and I asked if she had figured out her travel arrangements yet. Aunt Diane did not smile back. She froze completely. Her coffee cup hovered inches from her mouth, her eyes darting frantically from my phone screen to my face. The bustling noise of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of the nearby tables, all of it seemed to dial down to a low hum as I watched the color drain from her cheeks. She set her cup down so hard that dark liquid sloshed over the rim and stained the wooden table. For a long moment, she just stared at me with a mixture of confusion and profound pity. That look made my stomach drop before she even spoke a single word. Diane swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She asked me what I was talking about. I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, explaining that Chelsea's wedding was next Saturday and I was just finalizing my flight down to California. Diane reached across the table and gently pushed my phone face down against the wood. She took a ragged breath and said the words that would fundamentally alter the rest of my life. Whitney, Chelsea got married last weekend in Napa Valley. Did your mother not tell you? The air vanished from my lungs. The busy coffee shop around me faded into a blur of meaningless shapes and muffled sounds. Married last weekend. The phrase echoed in my mind, bouncing against the walls of my skull, refusing to compute. I stared at Diane, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to say she was joking or that I had misheard her. But her eyes were swimming with tears. She reached into her designer purse, pulled out her own phone, and tapped the screen a few times with trembling fingers. She slid the device across the table toward me. I looked down and saw a world I had been deliberately locked out of. There was Chelsea, radiant in a custom designer gown that must have cost more than my yearly salary, standing under a massive arch of white roses and imported orchids. There was my father, Richard, looking exceptionally proud in a tailored tuxedo, walking her down an aisle scattered with thick white petals. And there was my mother, Barbara, crying tears of perfect joy in the front row, wearing a silver dress that sparkled in the California sun. I scrolled blindly through the gallery, my thumb moving automatically, while my heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice. I saw cousins I had known my whole life laughing at the reception. I saw family friends who used to come over for Thanksgiving dinners raising crystal flutes. I saw dozens of people toasting to a celebration I was never meant to attend. I realized in that suffocating moment that I had been preemptively blocked from seeing any of these posts on my own social media accounts. My mother, my sister, my father, they had all restricted my access months ago. They had coordinated this massive deception. They had gone out of their way to ensure I lived in the dark while they celebrated in the sun. It was not a simple oversight or a lost invitation in the mail. It was a calculated, deliberate exclusion designed to erase me from the most important day of my sister's life. As I stared at the bright, smiling faces of my parents in those pictures, the bitter truth of my entire childhood snapped into sharp, undeniable focus. Chelsea had always been the golden child. She was the pageant queen groomed from birth to marry into high society. She was given the expensive private tutors, the luxury cars on her 16th birthday, and the endless financial bailouts whenever she maxed out her credit cards. I was the plain, overly practical middle child who was told to figure it out on my own. When I won academic awards or secured my first major job in finance, my parents clapped politely and asked if it came with a cash bonus so they would not have to help me with rent. When Chelsea simply managed to pass a basic college class, they threw a catered dinner party to celebrate her genius. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn a seat at their table, bending over backward to be the responsible, successful daughter they could be proud of. I thought my career, my financial stability, and my unwavering loyalty would finally make them see my worth. I thought if I just worked hard enough and demanded little enough, they would love me the same way they loved her. But looking at those extravagant wedding photos, I finally understood that I was never a part of their perfect family portrait. I was just the background character they tolerated when no one important was watching. Aunt Diane reached out to touch my hand, murmuring soft apologies, asking if I was okay. She looked terrified that I was going to break down right there in the middle of the cafe. But I did not scream. I did not cry. A cold, hard realization settled over my heart, freezing the desperate, hopeful child inside me once and for all. The grief and the shock were instantly replaced by a sudden, chilling clarity. I realized that crying over people who went out of their way to hide their joy from me was a waste of my energy. I stood up from the table, the wooden legs of my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I left my coffee untouched. I left the image of that navy blue dress still shining on my phone screen. I told Diane I needed to make a phone call and thanked her for her honesty. I walked out of the coffee shop and stepped into the gray Seattle rain, letting the cold drops hit my face. With trembling fingers, I pulled up my contacts and pressed the call button for my mother. It was time to stop pretending and demand the truth. I stood outside the cafe, the cold Seattle rain soaking instantly through my sensible black blazer. I did not care about the chill. I did not care about the people rushing past me on the sidewalk with their umbrellas. All I cared about was the burning sensation in my chest as I dialed my mother's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I half expected Barbara to send me straight to voicemail just as she had done with my emotional needs for the last 3 decades. But then the line clicked open. The sound of clinking crystal and cheerful background chatter flooded my ear. She was likely at her country club celebrating her successful deceit over a plate of expensive appetizers. I did not bother with a polite greeting. I did not ask how her day was. I asked her directly why I was currently standing in the pouring rain looking at social media photos of my younger sister getting married in Napa Valley. The background noise on her end suddenly muffled as a heavy door closed. She had stepped away from her friends to handle me. I braced myself for an excuse. I thought perhaps she would spin a fabricated story about a lost invitation in the mail, or a sudden elopement that nobody could plan for. I even braced myself for a fake, tearful apology, but Barbara did not do apologies. Instead, she went straight on the offensive. Her tone dripped with the kind of polished condescension usually reserved for unruly employees. "Let us be realistic here, Whitney," she sighed, treating my profound heartbreak as a minor annoyance. Gavin's family is very elite. They are accustomed to a certain standard of living and a specific social circle. I stood frozen on the wet pavement listening as the woman who gave birth to me systematically dismantled my worth. She continued, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth, dropping the ultimate insult with casual cruelty. Your awkwardness and your budget aesthetic just would not fit the wedding photos. Chelsea did not want to spend her special day worrying about you embarrassing us in front of the Prescotts. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. Yet in a sick way, they made perfect twisted sense. My budget aesthetic. That was her favorite term for the fact that I chose to pay off my student loans instead of buying designer handbags. That was her justification for erasing her own daughter from family history. She was telling me plainly and without a shred of guilt that my lack of superficial glamour was a justifiable reason to banish me from my only sister's wedding. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, the metal edge pressing painfully into my palm. I asked her if it ever occurred to her that I was her daughter. I asked if it mattered that I belonged there to support my sister, regardless of what brand of shoes I wore or how I looked in a group photo. My mother scoffed softly, the sound grating against my ear. She said I was always so dramatic, always making everything about my own feelings. She claimed Chelsea deserved a flawless weekend without the stress of managing my social inadequacies. She told me to stop acting like a victim and to be happy for my sister's elevated status. For 33 years, I would have internalized those toxic words. I would have accepted the blame. I would have hung up the phone, retreated to my small apartment, and cried until my eyes swelled shut. I would have spent months trying to change myself. Buying expensive clothes, I hated trying desperately to perform the role of the perfect high society daughter just to earn a single crumb of her approval. I would have apologized for ruining her afternoon. But standing there in the rain, something profound and permanent shifted inside me. I did not scream into the receiver. I did not cry. The desperate, pleading child inside me who had harbored a lifelong hunger for a mother's love evaporated completely. In her place, a cold, hard, indestructible realization settled over my heart. I saw Barbara clearly for the very first time. She was not a strict mother trying her best to guide me. She was a superficial, cruel woman who valued the opinions of wealthy strangers over the soul of her own child. The silence stretched between us on the line. I realized she was waiting for my usual conditioned response. She was waiting for me to apologize for being upset, to fold into myself and accept my designated role as the family scapegoat. She fully expected me to ask how the wedding ceremony went, to swallow my pride and grovel for a chance to celebrate with them at a later date. Instead, I took a slow, steady breath. The icy rain felt refreshing now, washing away the last traces of the desperate girl I used to be. I told my mother she was absolutely right. I told her I did not fit into her picture-perfect aesthetic, and I never would. Before she could launch into another patronizing lecture about my attitude, I cut her off. I told her to have a nice life. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, silencing her voice. I did not just hang up the phone. I severed the tie completely. Standing right there on Fifth Avenue, I opened my contacts list and blocked my mother's number. I blocked my father. I blocked Chelsea. I went onto all of my social media accounts and removed every single trace of them. I scrubbed my digital life clean of the people who had treated me like dirt to build their own pedestals. Walking back to my office building, my steps felt remarkably lighter. The phantom weight of their endless expectations had vanished. I returned to my desk, packed up my things, and went home to begin a new chapter. I spent the next 3 weeks living entirely for myself. The transition was jarring at first, but ultimately beautiful. There were no stressful Sunday evening phone calls where my career choices were belittled. There were no passive-aggressive text messages comparing me to my newlywed sister. There were no demands for me to perform financial or administrative duties for family events I was barely welcome at. There was just absolute glorious silence. I poured my energy into my work as an investment strategist. While my family assumed I was just a low-level corporate accountant, struggling to make ends meet, I was actually managing massive financial risk portfolios for top-tier clients. More importantly, I was managing my own private investments. I spent my evenings reviewing the exceptional returns on the real estate properties I had quietly acquired over the years. My personal portfolio was thriving beyond measure. The life I had built in absolute secret, the immense wealth I had accumulated quietly, while they mocked my sensible choices, was flourishing. I had created my own empire from the ground up, and I realized with deep satisfaction that I did not need to share a single piece of it with people who despised me. I was finally healing. 3 weeks of pure peace passed. I was moving on. I had almost convinced myself that my family had accepted my silent departure. I thought they were perfectly happy to never speak to their disappointing middle child again, now that they had their elite in-laws to focus their attention on. I should have known better. I should have known that toxic people only leave you alone until they desperately need something from you. It was a quiet Thursday evening. I was sitting on my velvet living room sofa enjoying a glass of wine and reviewing a quarterly maintenance report for one of my luxury properties. Suddenly, my phone screen lit up on the coffee table, vibrating against the glass. I frowned, reaching for the device. I had forgotten to block Chelsea on a secondary messaging app that I rarely used for personal communication. The notification banner flashed across the screen, glowing brightly in the dim room. I stared at the sender name, feeling my heart rate tick up slightly before the cold resolve settled back in. I opened the message. There was no apology for the phantom wedding. There was no acknowledgement of the elaborate, cruel deception they had pulled to keep me away. There was not even a polite greeting asking how I was doing after nearly a month of complete silence. It was just a staggering, breathtaking display of golden child audacity. I sat back against my sofa cushions and stared at the text message from my newly married sister. "Hey sis, I need a massive favor for my new in-laws. Call me as soon as possible." I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer audacity of her text message hung in the quiet air of my living room. I did not reply immediately. A minute later, the phone began to ring in my hand. The caller ID flashed my sister's name. Morbid curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear exactly how she planned to navigate this conversation. I tapped the green button and raised the phone to my ear. Chelsea did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She launched straight into a frantic, high-pitched monologue, as if the last month of absolute betrayal had never happened. She said my name with an exaggerated sigh of relief. She told me she was in a massive bind and needed my help right away. She explained that Gavin's parents were being completely impossible. According to Chelsea, the wealthy in-laws were insisting on a luxurious post-wedding family retreat. They wanted the full Pacific Northwest nature experience, but they refused to stay anywhere that did not feature a private chef, an infinity pool, and pristine water views. I remained perfectly silent. I sat back against my velvet sofa and let her dig her own grave. Chelsea continued, entirely undeterred by my lack of response. She told me she had been searching premium property listings online and found the absolute perfect place. It was a massive, ultra-modern waterfront estate on Lake Chelan. She rattled off the amenities like she was reading directly from a luxury travel brochure. She boasted about the 8 oversized bedrooms, the private deep water dock, and the imported stone architecture. Then she dropped the punchline. She told me she knew I did the accounting for the billionaire guy who owned that specific property. Her tone suddenly shifted into a sickly sweet register. She told me I had to pull some strings for her. She demanded that I contact my boss and tell him my sister just got married into a very prominent elite family. She wanted me to convince this imaginary billionaire to let them use the estate for a week. She told me to ask him to comp the entire stay, or at least provide a massive family discount. She actually claimed it would be great exposure for his rental business to host people of their caliber. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the liquid burn down my throat. The delusion was staggering. She truly believed the world revolved around her immediate demands. I spoke slowly, keeping my voice dangerously calm. I asked her to clarify what she was asking me to do. I asked her if she seriously wanted me to leverage my professional corporate reputation to beg a billionaire client for a free luxury vacation. I reminded her that she had just uninvited me from her own wedding because I was deemed socially unfit. I reminded her that my budget aesthetic was apparently too embarrassing to be captured in her flawless wedding photos. Chelsea gasped in exaggerated offense. She told me I was entirely missing the point. She claimed the wedding guest list was completely out of her control because Gavin's mother was very particular about head counts. She told me to stop holding a grudge over a simple administrative decision. She had the nerve to say this was about family coming together and healing. She demanded that I do my job as her older sister and secure that house immediately. She admitted she had already promised Gavin's mother she could easily get the property because she had insider connections. I set my wine glass down on the coffee table with a sharp thud. I told Chelsea my professional contacts were not her personal concierges. I told her I would not make a single phone call on her behalf. I pointed out that if the Prescotts were as wealthy and elite as she constantly claimed, they could easily pull out their own black cards and pay the $15,000 weekly rental rate themselves. I told her to never call me for a favor again, and I hung up the phone. I stood up from the sofa and walked down the hallway toward my home office. I needed to focus my mind on something productive to shake off the toxic energy. But before I could even reach the doorway, my phone rang again. This time, the screen showed my father's name. Richard was calling to tag team the abuse. I answered the call, leaning against the wooden doorframe of my office. Richard was practically shouting before I could even say hello. He demanded to know what was wrong with me. He asked why I was deliberately trying to sabotage my sister's happiness during the most important month of her life. I asked him if he was referring to the sister who conspired to hide her entire wedding from me. Richard scoffed loudly into the receiver. He told me to stop being so bitter and jealous. He said I was 33 years old and still single, and I needed to stop taking my personal romantic failures out on Chelsea. He claimed Chelsea was under immense pressure to impress the Prescott family. He said the in-laws were already judging our family background, and that I was being deeply selfish by refusing to step up and provide value when they needed it most. I asked my father a very simple question. I asked him why he was not paying for the luxury retreat himself, if it was so critical to preserving the family image. Richard stammered for a fraction of a second. His hesitation was brief, but it told me everything I needed to know. His anger flared up immediately to cover his panic. He yelled that he had already paid for an outrageously extravagant wedding ceremony in Napa Valley, and that securing a free vacation rental was the absolute least I could do to repay them for raising me. He told me I was an ungrateful daughter who only ever thought about herself. He delivered his final ultimatum with a voice full of pure venom. He told me to call my billionaire boss, secure that Lake Chelan estate by tomorrow morning, and call Chelsea to apologize for my atrocious behavior. He said if I did not get them that house, I was dead to this family. He promised I would be completely cut off, uninvited from every future holiday, and forgotten forever. I listened to the dial tone echoing in my ear after he slammed the phone down. Dead to the family. They truly believed that threatening to remove their toxic parasitic presence from my life was a severe punishment. They thought they were my only lifeline to the world. They thought I was just a sad, lonely accountant, desperate for their scraps of conditional love. I tossed my phone onto the desk. I walked into my sleek home office and sat down in my plush leather chair. I tapped the keyboard to wake up my massive dual-monitor setup. The screens flickered to life, casting a cool blue glow across the dark room. I did not open my corporate accounting software. I did not look up the contact information for a billionaire client. I opened a highly secure encrypted real estate portfolio management portal. I typed in my complex master password and hit enter. The screen loaded instantly. It displayed a stunning high-resolution aerial photograph of a sprawling modern waterfront mansion nestled against the pristine, deep blue waters of Lake Chelan. The property featured a private deep-water dock, an infinity pool seamlessly blending into the horizon, and thousands of square feet of imported stone. I did not do the accounting for the billionaire owner of this breathtaking property. I was the owner. I had purchased the estate as a distressed foreclosure 3 years ago. I leveraged my brilliant financial risk career and my aggressive investment strategies to completely rebuild it into a highly sought-after luxury haven. My family had absolutely no idea I was a multimillionaire. They assumed I just crunched numbers in a gray cubicle to barely make rent. They assumed I was poor because I refused to buy flashy designer clothes or lease luxury cars I could not afford. They mistook my financial discipline for poverty. I smiled at the beautiful property on my screen. I planned to close the browser and ignore my family completely. I was ready to let them drown in their own web of lies with the Prescott family. However, a bright red notification banner suddenly popped up on my property management dashboard. An automated alert from my luxury rental agency flashed across the screen. The Lake Chelan estate had just been booked for a full week at the premium summer rate of $15,000. I clicked on the reservation details to see who had just secured my property. I scrolled down to the payment section. The name on the pending credit card transaction stared back at me. The booking was under the name Gavin Prescott. Chelsea had gone behind my back. She bypassed my refusal entirely and booked the estate directly through the public luxury rental portal. She was bringing her new in-laws to my house. She was bringing my toxic parents to my house. And none of them had the slightest clue who actually held the keys to the castle. I stared at the reservation confirmation on my monitor. A cold smile slowly spread across my face. I clicked into the detailed itinerary to review the specific notes attached to the booking. Gavin had paid the premium deposit, but there was a lengthy, heavily detailed message typed into the special requests section. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyebrows raising higher with every sentence I read. Chelsea had meticulously crafted an elaborate fantasy for her new in-laws. She wrote to my rental agency explaining that she was the daughter of the wealthy owner. She claimed her father had recently purchased this massive estate as a private family investment property and that she had personally overseen all the high-end interior design renovations. She went on to request a private chef and daily housekeeping for the duration of the week. But the true masterpiece of her delusion was at the very bottom of the text box. Chelsea wrote that her family's personal assistant and property concierge would be on site to cater to their specific needs. She explicitly listed my full legal name and my direct cell phone number. She instructed the agency not to worry about staffing the house for guest management because Whitney would be there to handle all the cooking, cleaning, and trivial labor. The layers of her deception stacked up perfectly in my mind. She was lying to her new wealthy in-laws. She had bounced from California to Seattle telling the Prescott family that our father was a real estate mogul. She was using my multi-million-dollar house to legitimize her massive lie. Furthermore, she planned to force me into the role of the hired help to keep me in my designated place. This was her strategy to guarantee I would not mingle as a family member and embarrass her budget aesthetic in front of Gavin's parents. She wanted to parade me around as a servant. The standard protocol for a fraudulent or highly suspicious booking was an immediate cancellation. A single click of my mouse would refund the $15,000 to Gavin's credit card, lock the calendar dates, and send them an automated rejection email. I hovered my cursor over the bright red cancel button. I stared at the screen for a long time. Canceling the reservation would be far too easy. It would let them off the hook before the game even started. It would allow Chelsea to spin another convenient lie to the Prescotts about why the house was suddenly unavailable due to plumbing issues or maintenance. I realized it was time to give my sister exactly what she had asked for. She wanted the ultimate property manager experience. She wanted me to be her concierge. I moved my cursor away from the cancel button. I clicked approve. The system chimed loudly in my quiet office, locking in their non-refundable stay. I closed my laptop and walked down the hallway into my master bedroom. I pulled my sleek designer suitcase from the top shelf of my closet. I did not pack my usual comfortable weekend clothes or the casual sweaters I preferred. I packed sharp, understated, highly professional attire. I folded tailored black blazers, crisp white button-down shirts, structured slacks, and sensible but expensive loafers. I was assembling the uniform of a high-end estate manager. I left my downtown Seattle apartment before dawn the next morning. I wanted to arrive at Lake Chelan 2 full days before their scheduled check-in time to ensure everything was perfectly aligned. The drive through the Cascade Mountains was profoundly peaceful. The winding mountain roads and the towering pine trees mirrored the calm, calculated focus settling over my mind. For the first time in 33 years, I felt no anxiety about seeing my family. I was not worried about my clothes being judged. I was not worried about my conversational skills being scrutinized by my mother. I held all the cards. I was the house they were walking into. The sheer irony of my family demanding access to a billionaire lifestyle while actively berating the very daughter providing it fueled my drive across the state. I pulled my car through the massive iron security gates of my property, just as the morning sun began to reflect off the deep blue water of Lake Chelan. The estate sat on a pristine, elevated bluff surrounded by lush landscaping. I had poured my heart and my aggressive investment earnings into every inch of this place. The imported Spanish stone exterior, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the infinity pool that cascaded seamlessly toward the horizon. It was my absolute masterpiece. Every tile, every fixture, and every piece of custom furniture had been selected by me. It represented my independence and my silent victory over a family that told me I would amount to nothing. My private chef, David, and my lead housekeeper, Maria, were already in the massive gourmet kitchen unpacking premium provisions when I walked through the front doors. They greeted me warmly, accustomed to my usual relaxed demeanor. I gathered my staff around the large marble island and issued a very specific, unusual set of instructions. I told them my estranged family was arriving for a week-long rental starting this afternoon. I informed them that my family fully believed I was merely the hired property manager and that the house belonged to a wealthy corporate client. I instructed David and Maria to play along perfectly. Under absolutely no circumstances were they to refer to me as the owner, the boss, or use any tone that implied I held authority over the estate. I was simply the manager, another employee on the payroll. David and Maria exchanged an amused, knowing glance. They had worked for me long enough to trust my judgment, and they agreed to follow my lead without hesitation. Maria even offered to hand me a spare feather duster if I needed to really sell the performance. After briefing the staff, I spent the entire afternoon walking through the estate to set my traps. I double-checked the high-end security system wired throughout the property. I ensured every camera in the common areas, the living room, the formal dining room, the patio, and the pool deck was recording perfectly with crystal-clear audio. My family had a long documented history of gaslighting me and denying their own abusive behavior. They loved to twist conversations and claim I was making things up. This time, I would have every single insult, every entitled demand, and every blatant lie captured on digital video. 2 days passed in quiet, meticulous preparation. On the afternoon of their scheduled check-in, I stood on the sprawling front porch. I wore my tailored black suit. My hair was pulled back into a severe professional bun that left no room for softness. I held a silver clipboard in my hands, completing the illusion of the hired help. I took a deep breath of the crisp lake air and waited. The sound of crunching gravel broke the peaceful silence of the afternoon. A convoy of 3 rented luxury SUVs turned into the long, sweeping driveway. They drove past the manicured lawns and parked in a neat line near the grand entrance. I stood perfectly still on the top step, my hands clasped professionally over my clipboard. The doors of the lead vehicle opened. Chelsea stepped out first. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a pristine white linen dress that looked entirely out of place for a mountain retreat. She looked around at the breathtaking architecture of my home with a smug, possessive smile on her face. She truly believed she had pulled off the ultimate deception. Then her eyes landed on me, standing on the porch. She did not look surprised to see me there. She looked completely vindicated. She marched up the stone steps, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. She stopped 2 feet away from me, lowered her designer sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, and snapped her fingers in my face. She told me it was good I was finally making myself useful for once in my life. She ordered me to grab her father-in-law's heavy bags from the trunk and carry them up to the master suite. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She warned me that whatever I did today, I was not to make direct eye contact with the Prescott family. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside the estate was cool and smelled faintly of expensive citrus and cedar wood. I left my suitcase near the sweeping staircase and walked directly to the central control panel mounted on the hallway wall. I needed to verify that the smart home systems were functioning perfectly. I tapped the digital screen, bringing up the security feed. Dozens of high-definition cameras covered the exterior perimeter, the driveway, the private dock, and every common area inside the house. I watched the live feeds flicker across the screen, confirming that the audio recording features were fully operational. My family had a long documented history of gaslighting me. They loved to twist conversations, deny their own abusive behavior, and claim I was making things up to play the victim. This time I would have every single insult, every entitled demand, and every blatant lie captured on digital video. I spent the next hour walking through the massive property, inspecting the 8 oversized bedrooms and the pristine bathrooms. I ran my hand along the cool surface of the imported marble countertops in the chef's kitchen. I wanted everything to be immaculate. I wanted the Prescotts to be absolutely dazzled by the wealth and luxury of the estate. The more impressed they were by the house, the harder the fall would be when the truth finally came out. My private staff would be arriving later that afternoon to begin the final preparations, but for now I had the sprawling mansion entirely to myself. I walked out onto the back patio and looked down at the private deep-water dock. The water was perfectly calm, mirroring the clear blue sky above. I took a deep, steadying breath. I had 2 days to finalize my strategy, 2 days to prepare my staff for the performance of a lifetime, and 2 days to brace myself for the arrival of the people who had tried to erase me. I was no longer the forgotten middle child. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and I was going to manage this property exactly the way they demanded. The next 48 hours moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a ticking bomb. I spent my time ensuring that every trap was seamlessly integrated into the immaculate luxury of the estate. I sat at the massive kitchen island with my private chef David, reviewing the menu Chelsea had aggressively demanded in her booking notes. She had requested wild-caught salmon, imported white truffles, and prime Wagyu beef. She was trying to impress the Prescott family with a culinary experience she assumed she was getting entirely for free. I told David to spare absolutely no expense. I wanted the food to be so breathtakingly decadent that Gavin's parents would feel compelled to ask my father how much he paid for it. I wanted to watch Richard sweat as he tried to mentally calculate the price of a dinner that cost more than his monthly car payment. David was a master culinary artist who normally charged exorbitant fees for private events. When I told him the context of this particular week, he had smiled wickedly and promised to create a menu so intimidatingly sophisticated that it would make my family feel profoundly out of their depth. We planned a 7-course tasting menu for their welcome dinner, complete with vintage wine pairings from my private cellar. I wanted Chelsea to choke on her own fabricated wealth. I wanted the Prescotts to marvel at the impossible standards my father was supposedly maintaining. Every luxurious detail I authorized, every expensive bottle of wine I pulled from the racks, was another shovel full of dirt dug into their inevitable grave. The trap was lined with velvet and gold, and they were going to march right into it with blind, arrogant enthusiasm. Maria and her housekeeping team polished the imported stone floors until they gleamed like glass. I walked alongside them, running a white-gloved hand over the mahogany banisters and the custom wrought iron railings. I wanted the estate to look intimidatingly expensive. I gathered my staff one final time in the grand foyer just hours before the scheduled 3 o'clock check-in time. I reiterated the absolute most critical rule of the week. I reminded them that I was not Whitney, the self-made multimillionaire and owner of the property. I was Whitney, the hired concierge. I told them that if my mother snapped her fingers at me, they were to look away. If my sister demanded I scrub a toilet, I would smile and ask which cleaning supplies she preferred. I instructed my team to treat the guests with the utmost respect, knowing that every ounce of 5-star service would only make the final eviction that much more devastating. My staff nodded in unison. They were consummate professionals, but I could see the quiet thrill in their eyes. They knew a spectacular reckoning was coming. Before retreating to change my clothes, I walked into the hidden security room, located behind a false wood panel in the basement. I sat before a wall of monitors, displaying dozens of high-definition camera feeds. I checked the camera positioned above the grand stone fireplace in the living room. I checked the camera concealed near the outdoor infinity pool. I meticulously tested the audio receivers hidden in the formal dining room chandelier. The sound quality was flawless. I could hear the faint rustle of Maria placing crystal wine glasses on the long mahogany table. My family had a rich documented history of gaslighting me. They loved to twist conversations, deny their own abusive behavior, and claim I was just making things up to play the victim. This time, there would be no escaping the truth. I would have every single insult, every entitled demand, and every blatant lie captured on digital video. The evidence would be indisputable. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I retreated to my private quarters to prepare myself for the front lines. I dressed with tactical precision. I slipped into a tailored black blazer and matching slacks that fit flawlessly but intentionally lacked any flashy designer labels. I pulled my dark hair back into a severe, slicked, tight bun at the nape of my neck, ensuring not a single strand framed my face to offer any hint of softness. I wanted to look harsh, efficient, and entirely subservient. This was not just about clothes, it was about adopting a persona. For my entire life, my family had treated me like I was invisible, only acknowledging my existence when they needed a punching bag or a financial favor. Today, I was going to use their own narcissism against them. They expected a servant, so I would give them a servant. I would become a ghost in my own home, observing their lies and gathering my ammunition in plain sight. I picked up a sleek silver clipboard, clipping a blank itinerary and a pristine copy of the rental agreement to the front. The rental agreement was the most important prop of all. It contained the fraudulent credit card information and the strict cancellation policies that would eventually be their undoing. I checked my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror one last time. The woman staring back at me was a complete stranger to the family that was about to arrive. She was untethered from their judgment. She was cold, calculating, and absolutely untouchable. I walked out the heavy oak front doors and took my position at the top of the sweeping stone steps. The afternoon sun was warm, casting a brilliant golden light across the manicured lawns. The lake behind the house sparkled like a sea of crushed diamonds. It was exactly 3 o'clock. The sharp, heavy crunch of gravel echoed up the long, winding driveway. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped professionally over my clipboard, my breathing slow and measured. Through the towering pine trees, I spotted the glossy black hoods of 3 identical rented luxury sport utility vehicles. They moved in a slow, pretentious convoy, navigating the circular driveway before coming to a smooth halt right in front of the grand entrance. The vehicles gleamed in the sunlight, a desperate attempt to project wealth they did not actually possess. The heavy doors of the vehicles swung open. The loud, incredibly arrogant voices of my family pierced the tranquil silence of my mountain retreat. I watched Gavin step out of the driver's side of the second vehicle, adjusting his expensive sunglasses and stretching his arms as if he owned the very air he breathed. His parents, the supposedly elite Mr. and Mrs. Prescott, emerged from the back seats. Mrs. Prescott immediately gasped, holding a hand to her chest as she took in the towering stone columns and the sheer scale of the mansion. I could hear her telling my father how absolutely stunned she was by his exquisite taste in real estate. My father Richard stepped out of the third vehicle. He puffed out his chest and buttoned his suit jacket, loudly accepting the compliment for a house he could not afford to stand in for 5 minutes. My mother Barbara stepped out of the passenger side of my father's vehicle. She was dressed in a crisp beige pantsuit, carrying a designer handbag that I knew for a fact she had purchased at a discount outlet. She immediately rushed over to Mrs. Prescott, linking arms with her new in-law and pointing toward the infinity pool. Barbara began loudly boasting about how hard Richard had worked to secure this private sanctuary for their growing family. She laughed a high, artificial laugh, playing the role of the gracious, wealthy matriarch to absolute perfection. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to laugh out loud at the pathetic spectacle unfolding on my driveway. They were strutting around my property like peacocks, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were standing in the center of a finely tuned trap. But it was the lead vehicle that held my complete attention. The passenger door opened and Chelsea stepped out onto the crushed gravel. She wore a pristine white linen sundress and a wide-brimmed straw hat, looking like she had just stepped off a yacht in the Mediterranean. She paused for a moment, placing her hands on her hips, surveying the estate with a nauseatingly possessive smile. She truly believed she was the queen of the castle. She turned her head and began barking orders at Gavin to carefully unload her matching designer luggage from the trunk. Then she turned her gaze toward the massive front porch. She saw me. I waited for the flash of shock. I waited for her to panic, realizing that her scapegoat sister had actually shown up to the property to ruin her intricate web of lies. But Chelsea did not look surprised. She looked incredibly viciously triumphant. Her smile widened into a sharp, condescending smirk. She turned away from her new husband and marched directly up the stone steps toward me. Her high heels clicked aggressively against the pavement, echoing like a metronome counting down to her own destruction. She stopped exactly 2 feet away from me. She lowered her designer sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. She did not say hello. She did not ask how my drive was. She snapped her fingers directly in my face. "Good you are here," she commanded, her voice dripping with venom. "Grab my father-in-law's bags from the trunk and carry them up to the master suite right now. And whatever you do, do not make eye contact with them." I maintained my neutral expression. I did not blink. I simply nodded and stepped forward to retrieve the heavy leather duffel bags from the trunk of the luxury vehicle. Chelsea spun around her white dress, catching the mountain breeze, and immediately began playing the gracious hostess for her new family. Gavin and his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Prescott, were standing near the edge of the driveway. They were staring up at the massive timber beams and the imported stone exterior of my home. Mrs. Prescott let out an audible gasp of delight. She placed a hand over her heart and told Chelsea that the estate was absolutely magnificent. She said it looked like a spread from a prestigious architectural magazine. Chelsea smiled modestly, linking her arm through Gavin's elbow. She told her new mother-in-law that her father had purchased the property as a private family investment a few years ago. Then, with a practiced laugh, Chelsea added that she had practically designed the entire interior herself. She claimed she spent months selecting the custom furniture, choosing the color palettes, and curating the perfect rustic modern aesthetic. I stood behind them, gripping the leather handles of the heavy luggage, and listened to my younger sister completely fabricate a history for my house. I kept my face entirely blank, carrying the bags up the stone steps and setting them neatly inside the grand foyer. Just as I turned back toward the driveway, the third vehicle pulled up to the front entrance. My mother and father stepped out onto the crushed gravel. Barbara was busy adjusting her beige blazer, preparing her brightest, fakest smile for the Prescotts. Then her eyes darted past Mrs. Prescott and landed squarely on me, standing in the doorway. The fake smile vanished instantly. All the color drained from her face. Richard noticed her reaction, followed her gaze, and froze completely. For a split second, sheer panic radiated from my parents. They had spent the last month telling the Prescotts that I was a socially awkward embarrassment who was too poor and too busy working a low-level job to attend the wedding. Now I was standing in the foyer of the estate they were pretending to own. Barbara did not waste a single second. She plastered a rigid smile back onto her face, excused herself from the group, and marched up the steps. She grabbed my arm with bruising force, her manicured nails digging deeply into my black sleeve. She did not say a word to me out loud. She just dragged me roughly through the main hallway, past the gaping kitchen island, and shoved me directly into the massive walk-in pantry. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, plunging us into the dim light of the storage room. Richard slipped into the pantry right behind us, his face purple with suppressed rage. My mother rounded on me immediately. She kept her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper so the wealthy guests outside would not hear a thing. She demanded to know what I was doing there. She reminded me that she had explicitly told me to stay away from Chelsea and her new in-laws. She accused me of tracking them down just to ruin the most important vacation of her golden child's life. I stood perfectly still amidst the organized rows of premium spices and dry goods. I adjusted the lapels of my black blazer and looked at her with cool, calculated detachment. I told her I was not there to ruin anything. I explained that Chelsea had booked the property through a public luxury rental portal. I informed my mother that I was the required on-site manager per the agency policy and that Chelsea had specifically requested my services by name in the booking notes. Richard stepped forward, pointing an angry, shaking finger at my face. He told me I was lying. He said there was no way my pathetic little accounting firm managed properties of this extreme caliber. I held up my silver clipboard, showing him the official rental agreement with Chelsea's signature clearly printed at the bottom. I told him he could call the booking agency to verify it if he wanted. However, I added that if the designated manager left the premises for any reason, the contract would be instantly voided, and they would all have to vacate the property immediately. Barbara and Richard exchanged a look of pure trapped panic. They could not afford to get kicked out of the house. They had already bragged to the Prescotts about owning it. They were backed into a corner of their own making. Barbara narrowed her eyes, a cruel, calculating spark returning to her gaze. She told Richard that if I was required to be the hired help, they would treat me exactly like the hired help. She turned back to me and set the ground rules. She ordered me to stay completely out of sight. She forbade me from speaking to Gavin or his parents unless I was directly spoken to. She commanded me to play the role of the obedient servant and threatened to make my life a living nightmare if I slipped up. I simply nodded, telling her I understood my position perfectly. My parents walked out of the pantry with their heads held high, ready to resume their performance as wealthy elites. I followed a few paces behind, blending seamlessly into the background. For the next 2 hours, the abuse deepened exactly as I had anticipated. Richard and Barbara went out of their way to humiliate me in front of their new family to prove their dominance. When Mr. Prescott tracked a small amount of dirt from the driveway onto the pristine hardwood floor near the patio entrance, Richard snapped his fingers at me loudly. He ordered me to get a rag and clean up the mess immediately on my hands and knees. He turned and apologized to Mr. Prescott for the incompetence of the domestic staff, claiming good help was so hard to find these days. I retrieved a cloth and wiped the floor without a single word of complaint, keeping my face entirely devoid of emotion. Later, when Chelsea decided she wanted a fresh towel by the pool, she did not ask nicely. She shouted my name across the deck, commanding me to fetch one from the laundry room and bring her a glass of sparkling water with exactly 3 cubes of ice. I delivered the towel and the water with a polite, vacant smile. When Gavin asked where he should put his empty luggage, Richard ordered me to carry it all down to the storage room myself. They were reveling in their perceived power. They thought putting me in a servant role was a punishment. They thought it would break my spirit to serve them in such a luxurious setting. They had no idea that every demand they barked at me was being recorded by the high-definition security cameras seamlessly integrated into the ceiling corners. Eventually, Barbara decided my presence in the kitchen was too distracting for her comfort. She walked over to where I was polishing wine glasses and told me I was in the way. She ordered me to take my things and relocate to the cramped basement utility room. She told me I was not to mingle with the guests under any circumstances, and that I should remain downstairs until they required my services again. I bowed my head slightly, picked up my clipboard, and walked down the basement stairs. I sat in the utility room, surrounded by the hum of the massive water heaters and the glowing screens of my security monitors. I watched them on the live feed. I watched Chelsea pointing out the custom light fixtures, claiming she had sourced them from a vintage boutique in Paris. I watched Richard pouring expensive wine from my private cellar, acting like he was a generous benefactor sharing his personal reserve. They were digging a hole so deep they would never be able to climb out. Around 5 o'clock, the catering staff signaled that it was time for the evening reception to begin. I stood up from my chair in the utility room and smoothed out the wrinkles in my tailored black slacks. I walked upstairs to the kitchen, where my private chef had prepared a stunning tray of vintage champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. I picked up the heavy silver tray, balancing it perfectly on one hand. I walked out through the massive sliding glass doors and onto the sprawling back patio. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pristine pool deck. The two families were gathered around the large custom-built fire pit near the edge of the property, holding their empty glasses and waiting to be served. I approached silently, carrying the drinks they had demanded. As I stepped closer, the sharp, haughty voice of Mrs. Prescott drifted over the patio. She was standing right next to the fire pit, running her hand along the smooth, elegant stone surface of the surrounding structure. She was loudly admiring the craftsmanship, turning to look at my father with absolute awe in her eyes. She was telling Richard how incredibly brilliant he was to choose imported Italian marble for the outdoor entertainment area. I gripped the silver tray tightly, a perfectly calm, polite smile resting on my lips as I stepped into the center of the group to serve them. I stepped into the center of the gathering. The ice in the crystal glasses clinked softly against the silver tray. I moved with practiced efficiency, handing a glass of vintage champagne to Mrs. Prescott first. She took it without looking at me, her attention entirely focused on my father. She ran her hand over the smooth edge of the fire pit again, sighing dramatically. She told Richard that Italian marble was simply unmatched. She said she could always spot the quality of authentic Carrara stone, praising his refined eye for luxury architecture. She went on for several minutes, bragging to her husband about how Gavin was marrying into a family with such exquisite taste. Richard puffed out his chest, accepting a glass from my tray. He took a sip of the expensive champagne and nodded sagely. He told Mrs. Prescott that he only wanted the absolute best for this property. He actually had the nerve to claim he flew to Italy himself to select the slabs. I stood perfectly still. I waited until the entire group was listening, captivated by his fabricated wealth. Then I offered a polite, deferential smile. I cleared my throat softly. I told Mrs. Prescott that it was actually a very common misconception. I kept my voice helpful and entirely professional. I informed her that the stone was not Italian marble at all. I said it was actually a rare imported Spanish stone. I told her the owner specifically chose it for its high heat resistance around the fire pit, and that the custom installation cost exactly $80,000. The patio went completely dead silent. The only sound was the distant call of a bird over the lake. I looked directly at Mrs. Prescott and offered my most accommodating concierge smile. I told her that I handled all the financial records for the owner of the estate. I said I would be more than happy to print out the original Spanish import receipts from the management office if she wanted the name of the quarry for her own future renovations. Chelsea whipped her head around to look at me. If looks could cause physical harm, I would have dropped dead on the patio stones. Her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. The grand lie she had spun about designing the interior was suddenly looking incredibly fragile. She had spent the last month convincing these people she was a design prodigy who selected every material in the house. Now, the hired help was politely correcting the origin and the exact price tag of the patio she claimed to have built. Mrs. Prescott frowned, her heavy diamond earrings catching the fading sunlight as she turned her head. She looked confusedly at Richard. She asked him why he chose Spanish stone over Italian when he had just told her he flew to Italy to pick it out. She asked if he had changed his mind at the last minute. The color rapidly drained from my father's face. I watched his confident posture deflate like a punctured balloon. He had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable authority, demanding absolute perfection from me, while simultaneously holding me down. Now stripped of his usual defensive anger, because he had to maintain a polite facade for the Prescotts, he looked incredibly small. He stood there with his mouth slightly open, completely unequipped to answer a basic question about his own imaginary house. He looked at my mother for help, but Barbara was staring intensely at her champagne glass, pretending not to hear the question. Richard began to stammer. He stuttered out a pathetic, fragmented sentence about supply chain issues and international shipping delays. He claimed his contractors must have made a substitution without his direct approval. It was a weak, transparent lie, and everyone on the patio felt the sudden, uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere. Mr. Prescott narrowed his eyes slightly, taking a slow sip of his drink while studying my father. The illusion of the untouchable real estate mogul was cracking. I gave a brief polite nod to the group, asked if they needed anything else, and stepped backward into the shadows of the sliding glass doors. I retreated to the kitchen, leaving the sliding door open just a crack so I could hear the fallout. The conversation on the patio remained stiff and awkward for the next hour. Chelsea desperately tried to steer the topic away from the house and back to her recent wedding. She laughed too loudly at Gavin's jokes. Barbara quickly offered to show Mrs. Prescott the master suite, eager to escape the scrutiny. I stood at the kitchen island polishing a silver serving spoon, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I had not yelled. I had not caused a scene. I had simply presented a single undeniable fact, and it was enough to make their entire house of cards tremble. As the evening progressed, the tension in the house grew thicker. My family was walking on eggshells. They were terrified that I would emerge from the basement and drop another highly specific, extremely expensive fact that would expose their ignorance. They tried to keep the Prescotts contained in the living room, pouring them more wine and playing loud music to drown out any potential interruptions. But they could not control the environment because they did not own the environment. They did not know how the smart lighting worked. When the sun went down, Richard could not figure out how to turn on the exterior patio lights. He spent 10 minutes fumbling with the switches in the hallway while Gavin's father watched him with growing amusement. I eventually had to step out of the utility room and use my master tablet to illuminate the pool deck, silently demonstrating my complete control over the property. By 8 o'clock, the guests had retreated to their respective rooms to change for the formal welcome dinner my chef was preparing. I walked out to the pool deck to collect the empty champagne glasses. The night air was crisp and cool. The underwater lights of the infinity pool cast a bright, eerie glow across the imported stone. I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of heels marching across the patio behind me. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Chelsea was storming toward me, her white linen dress practically glowing in the dark. She marched right up to the edge of the pool where I was stacking glasses onto my tray. She checked over her shoulder to make sure Gavin and his parents were nowhere in sight. Then she turned her venomous glare on me. Her face was contorted with pure rage. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She hissed that I was embarrassing her on purpose. She accused me of being a jealous, bitter spinster who could not stand to see her younger sister secure a wealthy husband. She claimed I was purposely trying to make our parents look like fools, just to settle some pathetic childhood score. She told me I was deliberately trying to sabotage her marriage out of spite. I continued loading the crystal glasses onto my tray, moving at a calm, unhurried pace. I did not look at her finger pointing at my chest. I told her I was simply providing 5-star concierge service by offering the guests accurate information about the estate. I kept my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I told her that a true property manager must always know the exact specifications of the house they represent. Chelsea let out a short, hysterical laugh. She told me to cut the act. She said she knew exactly what I was doing and she was not going to let me ruin her week. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a vicious, threatening pitch. She ordered me to pack my stuff and leave her family's house right now. She said she did not care if the rental agency had a policy about an on-site manager. She claimed she would call them herself tomorrow and demand a replacement who actually knew how to stay out of sight. She told me to take my budget aesthetic and drive back to my miserable apartment in Seattle. She demanded that I be gone before the dinner was served. I picked up the silver tray. I finally turned to look my younger sister directly in the eyes. I saw the desperate, frantic need for control burning behind her glare. She thought she was the one issuing ultimatums. She thought she had the power to banish me from my own property. I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face, the kind of smile that did not reach my eyes. I told her she needed to read her rental agreement a little more carefully. I kept my voice low and dangerously smooth. I informed her that the contract she signed with the luxury agency had a very strict, non-negotiable security clause. I told her that if the designated manager leaves the premises due to guest hostility or is forced off the property, the rental agreement is instantly voided. I watched the initial confusion wash over her face, quickly followed by a creeping sense of dread as I explained the consequences. I told her that if I packed my bags and drove back to Seattle tonight, the security system would automatically lock the exterior doors. I said the power to the house would be remotely shut off, and they would all have to vacate the property immediately. I asked her how she planned to explain to her wealthy new in-laws that they were being evicted onto the street on the very first night of their luxury vacation. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining my cold, unyielding smile. I asked her if she would like me to call the owner right now to confirm the cancellation policy. Chelsea stood frozen by the glowing pool. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The furious, commanding golden child was entirely trapped. She could not fire me without losing the house, and she could not keep the house without enduring my presence. She realized she was completely at my mercy. I gave her a polite nod, turned my back on her paralyzed form, and walked smoothly into the house with my tray of empty glasses. The night was just beginning. I walked back through the sliding glass doors, the cool air conditioning of the main house, providing a stark contrast to the humid night air out by the pool. Chelsea remained rooted to the patio stones, outside her reflection, wavering in the illuminated water as she processed the reality of her total entrapment. I did not look back to gloat. I carried my silver tray straight to the kitchen, handed it to Maria with a quiet nod of thanks, and descended the stairs to my makeshift headquarters in the basement. Sitting in the dim light of the utility room, I opened my laptop. I wanted to review the guest manifest and ensure the remaining billing protocols for the week were locked in. I navigated to my secure property management dashboard. A flashing yellow alert icon pulsed at the top right corner of my screen. I clicked the icon, bringing up the detailed financial ledger for Chelsea's reservation. A fraud hold notification filled the center of my monitor. The initial $15,000 deposit had been charged to a premium platinum credit card, registered to Gavin Prescott. The transaction history log showed that the charge had been attempted 3 separate times over the past 48 hours. Each attempt had bounced due to insufficient funds. The wealthy elite Prescott family did not have enough liquid credit to cover a single one-week vacation rental. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the digital paper trail with deep fascination. Because Gavin's card had repeatedly failed to process, the automated booking system had triggered the secondary payment method held on file to secure the reservation. The secondary credit card belonged to my father. Richard had quietly stepped in to cover the massive expense when his new son-in-law's finances fell through. The sheer magnitude of their collective deception washed over me in a wave of dark realization. Chelsea had married into a family that was actively faking their high society status. Meanwhile, my father, a man who consistently complained about the cost of my college textbooks and told me to figure out my own rent, was secretly draining his own rapidly depleting credit limits to finance a luxury vacation for people who were just as broke as he was. They were all drowning in a sea of fabricated wealth, desperately trying to impress each other while standing inside a magnificent house paid for by the daughter they threw away. I kept that financial revelation locked securely in my mind as the sun rose the following morning. The tension in the estate was thick and palpable. Chelsea avoided making eye contact with me, entirely communicating her daily demands through sharp written notes left aggressively on the kitchen island. Richard paced the long hallways, taking hushed, frantic phone calls that sounded suspiciously like heated conversations with angry creditors. I simply went about my duties, gliding through the rooms like a well-dressed shadow, ensuring every surface gleamed and every crystal glass was filled. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, David prepared a lavish seafood luncheon. He served butter-poached lobster and seared scallops on the sprawling outdoor terrace. The two families sat around the long teak dining table, the sparkling blue lake providing a picturesque backdrop for their continued charade. I stood quietly near the perimeter of the terrace, holding a bottle of chilled vintage Chardonnay wrapped in a crisp white napkin. I observed the shifting dynamics of the group with intense focus. The initial awe the Prescotts had displayed upon arrival was beginning to curdle into a strange competitive arrogance. Mr. Prescott leaned back in his patio chair, swirling the expensive wine in his glass. He fixed his gaze on my father. He loudly remarked that maintaining an estate of this magnitude must require a rather vast and diversified real estate portfolio. He asked Richard directly about his other investment properties, adopting the condescending tone of a seasoned tycoon testing a peer. Richard swallowed hard. I saw a bead of sweat form at his temple catching the bright afternoon sunlight. He adjusted his collar and forced a hearty artificial laugh that sounded entirely hollow. He began to bluff with reckless abandon. He claimed he owned massive commercial developments all up and down the West Coast. He tossed out generic real estate buzzwords he had likely heard on television talking about aggressive expansion strategies and leveraging premium market assets. He sounded exactly like a man who was reading the back cover of a business book without ever opening the pages to understand the contents. I recognized the perfect opening. I stepped forward smoothly, approaching the table to refill Mr. Prescott's empty glass. As I poured the pale gold liquid, I kept my eyes respectfully lowered, playing the role of the attentive invisible concierge. I waited for a brief pause in my father's rambling monologue. I cleared my throat softly, projecting an air of innocent professional curiosity. I addressed my father directly in front of the entire table. I told him that since he dealt so extensively in high-level waterfront acquisitions, I was hoping he could clarify a complex regulatory issue for me. I kept my voice perfectly even and inquisitive. I asked him how his portfolio managers were currently navigating the recent highly restrictive changes to the 1031 exchange regulations, specifically regarding shoreline zoning taxes. I casually added that the actual owner of this property had just been discussing the severe capital gains implications of those new tax codes, and I thought a seasoned investor like himself might have some brilliant insights to share. The silence that fell over the terrace was absolute and deafening. The clinking of silverware stopped instantly. Chelsea closed her eyes, her face twisting in pure, unadulterated agony as she realized what I was doing. Mr. Prescott leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes locking onto Richard with intense, predatory interest. He nodded slowly, stating that it was indeed a very pertinent question for modern waterfront investors. He asked Richard to share his strategy with the table. Richard completely froze. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking ashen and terrified. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked desperately at Barbara for a lifeline, but my mother was staring intently at her lobster plate, paralyzed by the sudden spotlight. Richard finally stammered out a series of broken, incoherent syllables. He tried to string together a sentence about standard tax write-offs and basic property depreciation, completely missing the complex nuances of capital gains and tax-deferred exchanges. He fumbled the terminology so badly that he essentially claimed he evaded taxes through standard residential loopholes, a statement that was not only financially illiterate, but legally absurd. Mr. Prescott's eyes narrowed into tiny, suspicious slits. The illusion of my father's wealth shattered right there over the extravagant lunch table. Gavin's father could smell the fraud. He realized he was not sitting across from a real estate mogul with a vast portfolio. He was sitting across from a desperate man who did not understand the most basic tax laws governing the multi-million-dollar property he claimed to own. The air grew thick with heavy, unspoken accusations. The humiliation was too much for Richard to bear. The profound embarrassment instantly morphed into explosive, irrational rage. He slammed his hands down on the teak table, making the fine china rattle loudly against the wood. He abruptly stood up his chair, scraping violently against the stone patio. He offered a tight, furious apology to the Prescotts for the staff's highly inappropriate and disrespectful interruption. He did not wait for a response. He marched directly over to me. He grabbed me tightly by the upper arm, his fingers digging painfully through the fabric of my tailored black blazer. He did not care about maintaining a polite facade anymore. He physically turned me around and dragged me away from the dining table. He pulled me forcefully through the sliding glass doors out of the bright afternoon sunlight and into the secluded, shadowed hallway of the main house. Richard's grip on my arm was a vice of pure, unfiltered panic. He dragged me away from the sunlit terrace, pulling me forcefully through the heavy, sliding glass doors and into the cool, shadowed corridor of the main house. The sudden shift in temperature mirrored the drastic shift in his demeanor. Outside on the patio, he had been desperately trying to play the role of the affable, untouchable real estate tycoon for his new extended family. Here, hidden from the judging eyes of the Prescott family, he instantly reverted to the angry, domineering bully who had terrorized my entire childhood. He shoved me roughly, forcing me to stop near a massive imported console table. His face was flushed a dangerous mottled shade of purple. A thick vein pulsed erratically at his temple. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive but poorly tailored suit jacket. He thought he had successfully isolated me. He thought he had dragged me into the dark where he could exert his ultimate authority without any witnesses. He was completely wrong. He had just stepped into the exact arena I had meticulously designed for his downfall. He leaned into my personal space, his voice a harsh, venomous hiss designed to cut me down to size. He accused me of deliberately trying to ruin my sister's marriage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and told me I was nothing but a bitter, jealous failure who could not stand to see Chelsea secure a wealthy, elite future. He threw every toxic insult he had hoarded over the years right at my face. He called me a glorified maid. He said I was a pathetic, lonely woman who had to serve drinks to her own family just to feel a scrap of relevance. He claimed I had intentionally sabotaged his conversation with Gavin's father out of pure malicious spite because I was angry about not being invited to the wedding. He told me I was an embarrassment to the family name and that I had absolutely no right to speak to a man of his caliber with such staggering disrespect. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight and unwavering. I did not flinch away from his pointing finger. I did not defend myself against his ridiculous accusations. I let him expend his remaining energy on empty threats. I watched the desperation fueling his rage. He was terrified that the Prescotts were figuring out the truth about his fabricated wealth, and his only coping mechanism was to try and destroy the daughter he deemed an easy target. He told me I was going to pay dearly for opening my mouth about the Spanish stone. He told me I had crossed a line that I could never uncross. When his barrage of insults failed to produce a single tear or a solitary wince of submission from me, his frustration boiled over into a desperate ultimatum. He demanded that I give him the direct contact information of my superior. He thrust his right hand out, palm facing up, ordering me to hand over the private phone number of the billionaire owner of the estate. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon a scrap of intimidating authority to mask his overwhelming insecurity. He told me he was going to call my boss right this second. He promised he was going to expose my gross insubordination and have me fired on the spot. He threatened to have me forcibly removed from the property by security before the dessert course was even served to his guests. He said he was going to make sure I was blacklisted from every luxury hospitality agency on the entire West Coast. He was entirely convinced that he held the power to destroy my livelihood with a single phone call. He thought invoking the wrath of my imaginary billionaire boss would finally bring me to my knees and force me to beg for my job. I looked down at his outstretched, trembling hand. Then I looked back up into his furious, bloodshot eyes. I did not speak a single word of protest. I moved with agonizing, deliberate slowness. I reached my right hand into the interior pocket of my tailored black blazer. My fingers brushed against the smooth, ultra-thick premium cardstock of my personal business card. It was a beautiful, minimalist design that I had commissioned myself. It featured only my full legal name and my direct, private cell phone number stamped in subtle silver foil. There was no corporate logo. There was no job title. There was no luxury rental agency branding. It was simply the direct contact information for the sole owner of the multi-million-dollar property we were currently standing inside. I pulled the sleek card from my pocket. I held it lightly between my index and middle fingers, displaying it like a winning lottery ticket. I placed the crisp card directly into the center of my father's sweaty palm. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice a calm, smooth whisper of absolute ice. I told him to go ahead. I told him to call the owner. Richard snatched the business card from my hand with a loud scoff of pure contempt. He barely glanced at the sleek, minimalist design. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He unlocked the screen with aggressive, jerky movements. He stared at the silver numbers printed on my card and began punching them into his phone keypad. He hit each number with unnecessary force, his thumbs jabbing the glass screen as if he were physically striking me with every digit. When he finished typing the number, he pressed the green call button and immediately brought the phone up to his ear. He glared at me over the top of the device. A triumphant, malicious smirk slowly spread across his face. He thought he had won the ultimate victory. He thought he was seconds away from hearing a wealthy executive apologize profusely for my terrible behavior. He stood tall, waiting for the connection to go through, fully prepared to unleash his manufactured outrage upon my superior. He told me I was about to learn a very hard, very permanent lesson about respect and knowing my place. I did not break eye contact. I stood perfectly rooted to the imported hardwood floor, breathing evenly. I waited. The silence in the long, shadowed hallway was heavy and suffocating. 1 second passed. 2 seconds passed. 3 seconds ticked by in agonizing slow motion. Then, breaking the tense, quiet atmosphere of the secluded corridor, a sharp sound erupted. The customized, piercing ringtone of my personal cell phone began to blare loudly from the front pocket of my black blazer. The digital melody echoed brightly off the high ceilings and the expensive stone walls. It was clear, unrelenting, and completely unmistakable. I did not reach down to silence it. I made absolutely no move to answer the call. I simply let the phone ring loudly against my hip, the sound vibrating through the dark fabric of my suit. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me. I watched my father. I watched the exact precise moment the truth finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. I watched the triumphant smirk freeze completely on his lips. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror as the ringing from my pocket perfectly synchronized with the dial tone echoing in his ear. He slowly lowered his cell phone away from his head, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device onto the floor. He looked down at the glowing screen of his phone, confirming the number he had just dialed. Then he looked up at the pocket of my blazer, where the relentless ringing continued to sound. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack. The realization hit him with the devastating, inescapable force of a freight train. The billionaire owner he was trying to call to demand my termination was standing right in front of him. The ringing of my customized cell phone melody filled the narrow, shadowed hallway. It was a standard, generic digital chime, but in that precise moment it sounded like a funeral march for my father's massive ego. Richard stood absolutely frozen against the imported stone wall. The expensive smartphone was still pressed tightly against his ear. I watched his bloodshot eyes dart frantically from my calm face to the front pocket of my black blazer and back again. His brain was desperately trying to reject the impossible information it was receiving. He slowly pulled his phone away from his ear and looked down at the active call screen. He verified the digits he had just typed in with his own trembling fingers. He looked back at me, his mouth opening and closing in silent, sputtering disbelief. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a terrifying shade of translucent, sickly gray. He was finally putting the pieces together. He realized the distressed foreclosure property I had casually mentioned buying 3 years ago was not some tiny, dilapidated shack in the woods. It was this $4.5 million luxury waterfront estate. He realized the budget aesthetic my mother had mocked relentlessly was a conscious, highly disciplined financial choice that had made me the wealthiest person in the entire family. He realized I was not a maid, I was not a concierge, and I was certainly not a victim. I was the architect of his total ruin, and he had willingly marched his entire fabricated life right through my front doors. He tried to speak. He tried to form a word, a question, an excuse, or perhaps an apology, but his vocal cords absolutely refused to cooperate. He just stood there, looking exactly like a man who had stepped blindly off a cliff and was suspended in mid-air, waiting for the inevitable crushing impact with the ground below. Before Richard could summon the breath to say a single coherent word, a sharp, clear sound pierced the heavy tension of the corridor. It was the delicate ringing chime of a silver spoon tapping gently against a crystal champagne flute. The sound drifted in from the formal dining room just around the corner. Mrs. Prescott was calling the dinner table to order. The extravagant welcome feast had reached the dessert course, and it was time for the traditional evening toasts. I looked at my father. I did not offer him a lifeline. I did not give him a chance to beg for my silence or negotiate a surrender. I simply reached my hand into my pocket and silenced my ringing phone, letting the quiet dread settle back over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I told him he should probably get back to his distinguished guests. I turned on the heel of my leather loafer and walked away, leaving him paralyzed in the shadows. I moved smoothly down the hall, stepping back into the warm, golden light of the custom dining room chandeliers. The scene in the formal dining room was a flawless portrait of manufactured high society perfection. My private chef David had truly outdone himself. The long mahogany table was littered with empty porcelain plates that had previously held prime Wagyu beef and delicate white truffles. The vintage wine was flowing freely, staining the lips of people who could not afford to buy the empty bottles. Gavin and his parents sat on one side of the table, looking incredibly satisfied and thoroughly impressed by the sheer decadence of the evening. My mother Barbara sat rigidly on the opposite side. Her fake, gracious smile was plastered firmly in place as she waited for Richard to return to his designated seat at the head of the table. Chelsea was standing near the center of the room. She wore a glowing, triumphant expression that made my stomach turn. She held a fresh glass of sparkling champagne in her hand, the rising bubbles catching the warm light from the fixtures above. She waited patiently for everyone to give her their undivided attention before she began to speak. Her voice dripped with artificial sweetness and a heavily practiced nauseating humility. She welcomed Gavin's parents to the beautiful Pacific Northwest. She talked poetically about how two incredible elite families were finally becoming one. Then she raised her glass higher and turned her gaze toward the empty chair where Richard was supposed to be sitting. She announced that she wanted to make a very special, heartfelt toast to her incredibly generous parents. She thanked them profusely for opening up their private family estate for this luxurious post-wedding retreat. She placed a hand over her heart and claimed she was so incredibly blessed to have parents who provided such a magnificent world-class home for them to celebrate their new marriage. The Prescotts smiled warmly and raised their glasses in eager agreement. Barbara beamed, soaking in the unearned praise and basking in the false glory of a wealth she did not possess. I stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway. I walked directly into the center of the formal dining room, moving with silent, unhurried precision. I stopped right at the edge of the polished mahogany table. I did not have a glass of vintage champagne. I picked up a simple crystal glass of ice water from the silver serving tray nearby. I held it up high, perfectly mirroring Chelsea's celebratory posture. I told the room that I would actually like to make a toast as well. The polite smiles on the faces of the Prescott family remained intact, though a distinct flicker of confusion crossed Gavin's eyes. He clearly thought it was highly unorthodox for the hired property manager to interrupt an intimate family toast. Barbara's smile instantly vanished. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked frantically toward the hallway, desperately searching for Richard to come and physically stop me from speaking. But Richard was still trapped in his own personal nightmare, out of sight, unable to save her. Chelsea lowered her champagne glass by a fraction of an inch. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, venomous warning. She silently commanded me to shut my mouth, turn around, and retreat to the basement utility room where I belonged. I ignored her completely. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting the clear, calm authority of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. I raised my water glass toward my sister. I offered a toast to the happy couple. I congratulated them on their beautiful, highly exclusive secret wedding in Napa Valley. Then I let my voice carry to every corner of the silent dining room so that no one could miss a single syllable. I toasted to the bride and groom, who explicitly excluded me from their wedding because I was deemed socially unfit for their new elite lifestyle. I turned my head and looked directly into Mrs. Prescott's eyes as I spoke the next words. I told the entire table that my own sister had banished me from her special day because she told me my budget aesthetic would embarrass the family. I stated plainly that I was uninvited because I was simply too poor, too practical, and too plain to be featured in their flawless high society wedding photos. I raised my water glass one final inch, taking a slow, deliberate sip as the crushing weight of my words settled over the magnificent room. The formal dining room went dead silent. It was the kind of absolute ringing silence that sucks the oxygen straight out of the atmosphere and makes the air feel thick and unbreathable. Nobody moved a single muscle. Nobody dared to take a breath. Chelsea gasped loudly, a sharp, ugly sound of complete panic escaping her throat as her flawless facade shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The crystal champagne flute in her hand shook violently, spilling pale gold liquid onto the imported hardwood floor she had claimed to design. Gavin stared at his new wife with absolute horrified shock, his jaw dropping open. Barbara gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned a stark bone white. She looked like she was going to be physically sick right there on the imported Spanish stone. Mr. Prescott was the very first person to react. The wealthy patriarch set his wineglass down on the table with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed like a gunshot. He stood up from his chair, his imposing frame towering over the elegant dining spread. The polite, gracious father-in-law was entirely gone, replaced by a man who realized he had been dragged into a massive, humiliating deception. He looked from Chelsea's terrified, pale face to my calm, unwavering expression. He demanded in a low, dangerous voice to know exactly what was going on in this house. He demanded to know who I really was and why the hired help was accusing his new daughter-in-law of such atrocious behavior. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my professional, icy composure. I simply reached my right hand into the interior pocket of my tailored black blazer. I pulled out a crisp, heavy manila folder containing every single piece of financial and legal ammunition I had meticulously prepared. The grand unmasking had officially begun, and I was ready to burn their entire fabricated world to the ground. I held the thick manila folder in my right hand. The weight of the paper felt like absolute justice. Every single eye at the long mahogany dining table was fixed directly on me. Mr. Prescott was still standing. His chest was heaving with indignation. He demanded answers. He wanted to know why the hired help was interrupting his luxury vacation. I was more than happy to provide him with the exact truth. I stepped closer to the edge of the table. I moved right past Chelsea. My sister was currently shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. I placed the folder down onto the polished wood. The sound it made was soft, but incredibly definitive. I flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. I looked directly at Gavin's parents. I told them I wanted to clarify exactly what kind of establishment they were currently sitting inside. I reached into the folder and pulled out the original property deed. It was printed on thick, expensive legal paper. It bore the official gold seal of the state and the county auditor. I slid the document across the smooth surface of the table. I pushed it right in front of Mr. Prescott. I told the entire room that this was not my parents' estate. I kept my voice incredibly calm and perfectly measured. I stated clearly that my father did not purchase this massive property as a private family investment. I announced that I bought this distressed foreclosure 3 years ago. I explained how I leveraged my own highly successful career in financial risk management to completely restore it. I looked at my mother. Barbara was currently weeping silent tears of absolute terror. I told the room that I was the sole legal owner of the $4.5 million house they were currently dining in. The collective gasp that sucked the air out of the dining room was magnificent. Mr. Prescott looked down at the official deed. His eyes scanned the document rapidly. He registered my full legal name printed in bold black ink at the very top of the page. He looked up at me. His expression shifted from defensive anger to profound, staggered disbelief. Before he could even process the magnitude of that revelation, I pulled out the second document. It was a pristine multi-page printout of the luxury rental agreement. I slid this document right next to the deed. I tapped my index finger against the signature line at the bottom. I looked at Gavin. The groom was staring at his new wife as if she had just grown a second head. I told the Prescott family that my sister did not design the interior of this home. I explained that she had absolutely no creative or financial input in any of the imported stone or the custom furniture they had been admiring all day. I informed them that Chelsea had gone completely behind my back. I stated that she booked this property through a public luxury vacation rental portal using a fake backstory. She had lied to them entirely. I explained how she wanted to pretend she came from a lineage of massive, untouchable wealth. She rented a house she could not afford and attempted to force the actual owner into playing the role of a subservient maid. Chelsea let out a loud, pathetic sob. She covered her face with her trembling hands. She was completely unable to defend herself against the hard physical evidence sitting on the table. But I was not finished. The grand unmasking required absolute total exposure. I turned my attention fully to the groom. Gavin had spent the entire afternoon acting like royalty. He had treated my private staff with casual disdain. He projected the image of a man born into endless privilege. I reached into my folder and pulled out the detailed financial ledger from the booking agency. I slid the transaction history across the table toward him. I told Gavin that it was truly fascinating how his family demanded a private chef, an infinity pool, and a flawless Pacific Northwest retreat when they could not even cover the basic booking deposit. I pointed to the bright red fraud alert printed clearly on the ledger. I announced to the room that the initial $15,000 charge had been attempted on Gavin's premium credit card 3 separate times. I kept my voice smooth and entirely merciless. I told the table that every single attempt had bounced due to insufficient funds. The illusion of the elite untouchable Prescott fortune evaporated into thin air. Gavin's jaw dropped. The arrogant, wealthy groom was suddenly exposed as a man drowning in invisible debt. His mother let out a sharp cry. She clutched her pearl necklace as if someone had just physically struck her. She looked at her son with wide, horrified eyes. She realized their own financial charade was being broadcast in front of everyone. I did not give them a single moment to recover. I turned my gaze toward the empty chair at the head of the table. I knew my father was still cowering in the dark hallway just outside the dining room. I knew he was listening to every single word. I raised my voice slightly so it would carry through the open archway. I explained to the Prescott family exactly how their luxurious vacation was actually funded. I told them that when Gavin's credit card continuously failed to process, the automated booking system triggered the secondary payment method held on file. I pulled out the final receipt showing the successful transaction. I told them that Richard was the one who quietly covered the bounced check. I reminded them that Richard had just spent the last 2 hours boasting about his vast imaginary real estate portfolio. I informed the room that my father was secretly draining his own rapidly depleting credit limits to finance a luxury vacation for a family that was just as broke as he was. I stated plainly that my parents were drowning in massive debt. They were teetering dangerously on the very edge of total bankruptcy, all to maintain the pathetic illusion of high society status. I looked at my mother. Barbara was shaking violently. Her face was buried in her hands. Her immaculate beige suit looked completely absurd against the backdrop of her total ruin. They had sacrificed their own daughter just to secure a wedding aesthetic. They had bankrupted themselves to impress a family of frauds. The facade shattered completely. There was no polite recovery. There was no gracious way to smooth over the devastating, humiliating truth laying in black and white on the mahogany table. The room descended into absolute vicious chaos. Gavin spun around to face his new wife. His face was contorted with pure rage. He slammed his fist onto the table. He made the crystal water glasses rattle loudly. He screamed at Chelsea. He accused her of being a manipulative, psychotic liar. He shouted that she had misled him for their entire relationship about her family's wealth and social standing. He looked at the property deed and yelled that she was nothing but a pathetic fraud trying to steal her sister's success. Chelsea did not shrink away. She dropped her hands from her face and screamed right back at him. Her voice was shrill and desperate. She shrieked that Gavin had absolutely no right to judge her when his own credit cards were bouncing all over the internet. She called him a fake, a loser, and a massive disappointment. She yelled that he had promised her a lifestyle of elite luxury, but he was completely broke and living off the illusion of his parents' past successes. Mr. Prescott completely lost whatever remained of his dignified composure. He turned his fury toward the hallway. He shouted for Richard to come out and face him like a man. He yelled that he had been tricked into flying across the country to associate with a family of financially unstable liars. My mother finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. Barbara stood up from her chair. Her face was red and streaked with mascara. She started screaming at Gavin's mother. She called the Prescotts a bunch of pathetic grifters who were trying to leech off her daughters. Mrs. Prescott shrieked back. She insulted my mother's cheap clothes and her completely delusional sense of superiority. The two families erupted into a vicious, humiliating argument. Their superficial high society alliance was utterly destroyed in minutes. They hurled insults across the elegant spread of untouched desserts. They exposed each other's deep financial insecurities. They violently tore down the delicate web of lies they had all spent months carefully weaving. The beautiful, elegant dining room transformed into a war zone of shattered egos and profound regret. I stepped back from the table. I stood perfectly calm near the doorway. I watched the magnificent, chaotic destruction of the people who had tried to erase my existence. I stood perfectly calm near the arched doorway, watching the magnificent, chaotic destruction of the people who had tried to erase my existence. The formal dining room had become a spectacular battlefield of shattered crystal and ruined egos. Gavin was pacing furiously back and forth across the imported stone floor, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, while shouting that he was going to contact a high-powered divorce attorney first thing in the morning. Chelsea was slumped in her heavy wooden chair, sobbing hysterically into her trembling hands. Her pristine white linen dress was now stained with splashes of the vintage red wine she had knocked over in her blind panic. At the other end of the massive table, Mr. Prescott was aggressively pointing his finger at my father, demanding full immediate reimbursement for his first-class plane tickets and threatening to file a massive lawsuit for profound emotional and financial distress. I let the vicious screaming match continue for several more minutes. I wanted them to completely exhaust themselves. I wanted them to fully experience the bitter, suffocating taste of their own toxic medicine. For 33 long years, I had been forced to swallow my pride, bite my tongue, and endure their endless demands just to keep the fragile peace in our household. Now they were tearing each other apart like wild animals, over the very lies they had built their entire identities upon. The expensive butter-poached lobster and the delicate seared scallops sat completely untouched on the fine porcelain plates, growing cold and congealing in the tense, heavy air. The luxurious welcome dinner they had demanded from me had turned into their ultimate Last Supper. When the shouting finally began to die down into exhausted, heavy panting and pathetic sniffles, I decided it was time to drop the final curtain on this pathetic performance. I stepped away from the shadows of the doorway. I walked with slow, deliberate, measured steps straight toward the head of the long mahogany table. This was the exact seat my father had arrogantly intended to occupy while playing the role of the generous billionaire patriarch, holding court over his wealthy new in-laws. I stood directly behind the tall, heavy chair and rested my hands on the carved wooden back, taking my rightful physical place in the room. My movement drew the exhausted, bloodshot eyes of every single person in the room. They looked at me with a mixture of raw hatred and desperate, terrified confusion. I did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy. I did not flinch under their combined glares. I reached into the thick manila folder one last time. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy white paper. It was not a property deed and it was not a financial ledger. It was a formal, legally binding document that my specialized real estate attorney had drafted and notarized for me before I even left Seattle. I placed the document flat on the table right next to the fraudulent luxury rental agreement. I smoothed my hand over the paper, ensuring it laid perfectly flat against the wood. I looked at the two families who had thought they could simply command my obedience, steal my life's work, and treat me like the hired help. I kept my voice incredibly smooth, projecting the absolute undeniable authority of a woman who held every single key to their current reality. I told them that as the sole legal owner of this property, I was officially exercising my rights under the strict cancellation policies of the luxury rental agency. I explained to the silent room that due to the explicitly fraudulent credit card information provided at the time of booking and the gross deliberate misrepresentation of the primary guest identity, they were all in immediate severe violation of the rental agreement. I made sure to look directly at Chelsea when I mentioned the fraudulent identity, reminding her that her lies had legal consequences. I did not raise my voice, but every word sliced through the room like a sharpened blade. I told them that the contract was entirely voided, effective immediately. I announced that they had exactly 30 minutes to pack their belongings and vacate my property. I stated plainly that if a single one of them was still standing on my estate when that 30 minutes expired, I would personally call the local authorities and have them all physically removed and arrested for criminal trespassing. The absolute finality of my formal eviction notice slammed into the room with the force of a physical blow. The grim reality of their situation finally penetrated their thick, arrogant skulls. They were not just humiliated and exposed in front of each other. They were about to be thrown out into the cold, dark mountains with absolutely nowhere to go. They were hours away from the nearest major city, and the sun had already set, leaving the winding mountain roads treacherous and dark. Mr. Prescott tried to bluster his way out of the consequence, relying on the bullying tactics wealthy men always assume will work. He puffed out his chest, leaning his knuckles on the table, and loudly declared that he was a highly respected businessman who would not be thrown out onto the street like a common criminal. He demanded that I allow them to stay the night, so they could make proper travel arrangements in the morning when the rental car agencies opened. I simply looked at him with eyes like ice. I told him that his respectability had bounced right along with his son's platinum credit card. I reminded him that the clock was actively ticking, and he was currently wasting his 30 minutes attempting to negotiate a contract that no longer existed. I told him he could either walk out the front door with his dignity intact, or he could be escorted out in handcuffs by the county sheriff. He snapped his mouth shut, his face turning a vibrant shade of furious red, and stormed out of the dining room, grabbing his wife by the arm to go pack their bags. Gavin followed his parents without a single backward glance at his new bride. He left Chelsea sitting entirely alone at the vast table, crying uncontrollably over the immediate ruin of her high society marriage. My father Richard looked completely and utterly defeated. The loud, domineering man who had threatened to disown me and destroy my career just 2 hours ago was now staring blankly at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. He slowly pushed himself up from his chair, looking like he had aged 20 years in a matter of minutes. He shuffled out of the room, an empty, broken shell of a man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost his entire world. Only my mother remained at the table. Barbara stared at the formal eviction notice resting on the mahogany wood as if it were a venomous snake. The sheer brutal reality of the situation finally broke through her endless layers of superficial narcissism and deeply ingrained denial. She realized that the daughter she had mocked, belittled, and systematically excluded from her family portrait was currently holding the absolute power to leave her stranded in the night. She looked up at me. Her immaculate hair was disheveled. Her expensive makeup was smeared down her cheeks in dark, muddy tracks. The arrogant, cruel matriarch who had locked me in a pantry just a few hours prior was completely gone. In her place was a desperate, panicking woman grasping blindly at straws. She pushed herself up from the table and stumbled toward me. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab my arm the same way she had done in the foyer. I took a deliberate, sharp step backward, refusing to let her touch my suit. Barbara burst into loud, frantic tears. It was not a calculated performance to impress her country club friends. It was the raw, ugly crying of a manipulative woman who had finally run out of options and excuses. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. She suddenly remembered that I was her daughter. She begged me to reconsider my harsh decision. She cried out my name, her voice cracking with manufactured desperation. She tried to rewrite history right there in the dining room, claiming that leaving me out of the wedding was just a terrible misunderstanding. She pleaded with me, saying that we were family, and families stick together through difficult times. She told me that I had so much money and so much incredible success that I could not possibly be cruel enough to just throw my own parents out into the cold, dark night. She begged me to show some compassion for my own blood, claiming she had always loved me deep down. I stood at the head of the table, surrounded by the total wreckage of their extravagant feast. I looked at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely invisible and entirely worthless. I thought about the painful, agonizing afternoon I had spent standing in the freezing Seattle rain, looking at the beautiful, radiant photos of a wedding I was banned from attending. I thought about the cruel, dismissive tone in her voice when she told me my budget aesthetic would ruin her perfect day and embarrass her in front of wealthy strangers. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel an ounce of pity for her sudden, desperate tears or her pathetic attempts to invoke family loyalty. I looked at my mother with eyes that held absolutely no warmth, no forgiveness, and no hesitation. I kept my voice perfectly steady, a flat, merciless statement of absolute fact. I told her that she had willingly thrown me out of her life for a wedding aesthetic. I raised my hand and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly toward the grand foyer. I told her the door was right there. Barbara stared at my outstretched arm as if it were a physical weapon. The finality of my gesture struck her with the force of a falling anvil. She opened her mouth to unleash another desperate sob to weaponize her tears one last time, but the absolute void of empathy in my eyes stopped her cold. She realized, perhaps for the very first time in my 33 years of life, that her emotional manipulation had completely lost its power. I was immune to her. She let out a ragged, humiliated gasp, spun around on her expensive heels, and fled toward the guest suites to pack her bags. The next 20 minutes were a symphony of pure, unadulterated chaos. The sprawling, elegant estate transformed into a frantic evacuation zone. Doors slammed heavily against doorframes. Suitcase zippers were zipped with aggressive, panicked force. The heavy, thudding footsteps of the Prescott family echoed down the imported stone hallways as they practically sprinted toward the exit. I stood near the massive front doors, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, watching the mass exodus of the people who had treated me like a peasant in my own kingdom. Mr. Prescott marched past me without a single word, his face locked in a tight, furious scowl as he dragged two heavy leather duffel bags behind him. His wife followed closely at his heels, her head bowed in profound social disgrace. The real spectacle, however, was unfolding right on the crushed gravel of my sweeping driveway. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch to watch the grand finale. Chelsea was standing near the back bumper of the rented luxury SUV, clutching a white designer weekender bag to her chest. Her pristine linen dress was stained and wrinkled. Her carefully styled hair was plastered to her wet, tear-streaked face. She was sobbing hysterically, begging Gavin to listen to her, pleading with him to get into the car so they could talk about it. Gavin was having absolutely none of it. The groom stood several feet away from her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face radiating pure, unfiltered disgust. He yelled across the driveway that there was absolutely nothing left to talk about. He told her she was a pathological liar who had humiliated his family and dragged them into a pathetic financial circus. He shouted that he was not spending another single second in a car with her. Chelsea shrieked his name, reaching a hand out toward him, but Gavin aggressively stepped backward. He pulled out his phone and loudly announced that he had just paid a premium surge rate to order a private black car service back to Seattle. He told her to enjoy the ride back with her bankrupt parents, because he was calling his lawyers the second the sun came up to file for a rapid annulment. Chelsea collapsed against the side of the SUV, her wails echoing sharply against the quiet mountain air. The golden child was finally experiencing the bitter, unavoidable consequences of her own horrific actions. As Gavin turned his back on his weeping bride and marched down the driveway to wait for his ride, my father emerged from the front doors. Richard looked like a completely broken man. His shoulders were severely slumped. His expensive suit looked rumpled and entirely too large for his deflated frame. He dragged his heavy suitcase across the porch, the wheels clattering loudly against the stone. He stopped a few feet away from me. He did not puff out his chest. He did not point his finger. He did not threaten to ruin my career or banish me from the family name. The bullying patriarch had been thoroughly eradicated. He looked up at me with tired, bloodshot eyes. He cleared his throat, a weak, pathetic sound. He tried to summon a tiny fraction of his former authority, but his voice shook with profound defeat. He told me that since they were being forcibly evicted on the very first night of their week-long reservation, he expected a full refund. He actually had the audacity to stand on my porch after lying to his in-laws and treating me like garbage and demand his $15,000 back. He claimed that keeping the money for a canceled stay was entirely unreasonable and that he desperately needed those funds returned to his credit account. I looked at the man who had mocked my practical lifestyle and ridiculed my financial discipline. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. I told him he should have read the fine print before he decided to finance a fraudulent luxury vacation. I kept my voice incredibly cold and rigidly professional. I informed him that according to the exact legally binding terms of the contract, he and Chelsea had signed any booking made under false pretenses, using fraudulent identity claims or utilizing unauthorized credit substitutions resulted in an immediate mandatory cancellation. I stated the policy with slow, deliberate precision. I told him that under those specific violation clauses, the entire deposit was strictly and permanently non-refundable. Richard stared at me, his jaw trembling. He opened his mouth to argue, to beg, to plead for financial mercy, but I did not give him the chance. I stepped backward into the grand foyer of my home. I looked directly into his desperate, defeated eyes. I told him to consider the $15,000 my late wedding gift to the happy couple. I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of my solid oak front door. I did not wait for his response. I pulled the heavy door shut, letting it close with a loud, definitive, and incredibly satisfying click. The heavy thud echoed through the quiet foyer, finalizing the total severing of our relationship. The lock engaged automatically, sealing my sanctuary and leaving my toxic family standing outside in the cold night air. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, listening to the muffled sounds of car doors slamming shut outside. The heavy engines of the luxury SUVs roared to life. I walked into the dark living room and stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched the vehicles slowly pull away from the house. I watched Gavin climb into the back of a separate black sedan that had just pulled through the security gates. The cars formed a depressing, fractured convoy as they navigated the circular driveway and headed toward the main exit. I stood in the quiet darkness of my magnificent home and watched the bright red taillights of their vehicles slowly fade down the winding mountain road. The red glowing dots grew smaller and smaller, disappearing behind the towering pine trees until the darkness swallowed them completely. They were gone. The heavy, suffocating shadow they had cast over my entire existence vanished along with them. The massive estate was suddenly incredibly peaceful. The chaotic, aggressive energy that my family had dragged through the front doors was entirely scrubbed clean. I walked slowly back into the formal dining room. The aftermath of the explosive confrontation was still scattered across the mahogany table. Overturned wine glasses, discarded napkins, and the cold, untouched remnants of David's spectacular seafood feast. My private chef and my lead housekeeper stepped quietly out from the kitchen hallway. David and Maria had remained completely out of sight during the entire screaming match, honoring my instructions perfectly. They walked into the dining room, surveying the messy table and the empty chairs. Maria looked at me, a small, deeply respectful smile touching the corners of her mouth. She asked me if I would like them to begin clearing the table. I smiled back at her, a genuine warm smile reaching my eyes for the first time all week. I told them they had done an absolutely magnificent job today. I thanked them for their flawless service and their unwavering professionalism. I told them to leave the mess for the morning and that they were fully dismissed for the night, with a massive bonus heading their way. They thanked me graciously and quietly retreated to their private staff quarters, leaving me entirely alone in my beautiful, silent house. I walked over to the edge of the dining table. A bottle of incredibly rare, expensive vintage red wine sat near the center of the wood, uncorked and barely touched. My father had demanded I fetch it from the cellar to impress the Prescotts, but the argument had erupted before anyone could actually enjoy it. I picked up a clean, pristine crystal wine glass from the serving sideboard. I lifted the heavy glass bottle and poured myself a generous measure of the dark ruby liquid. I carried my glass through the living room and pushed open the heavy sliding glass doors leading out to the back patio. I stepped out into the cool, crisp mountain night. The air was incredibly fresh, carrying the clean scent of the pine forest and the deep, cold water of Lake Chelan. The sky above was a vast, sprawling canopy of brilliant white stars, completely unpolluted by city lights. I walked across the imported Spanish stone of my pool deck. The underwater lights of the infinity pool cast a gentle, rippling blue glow against the patio. I walked all the way to the edge of the balcony, resting my hand against the cool metal of the railing. I looked out over the vast, peaceful expanse of the dark lake. The silence out here was not lonely or isolating. It was profound, heavy, and incredibly liberating. For my entire life, I had contorted myself into a dozen different shapes, trying to fit into a family that was determined to cut me down. I had accepted their insults, endured their exclusion, and quietly financed my own escape while they mocked my practical choices. They had uninvited me from a wedding because I did not fit their shallow, fabricated aesthetic. They had tried to turn me into a servant in my own home to protect their fragile, bankrupt egos. They had underestimated me at every single turn. I raised the crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive vintage wine. It tasted like absolute, undeniable victory. I had lost my toxic family tonight. I would never receive another passive-aggressive phone call. I would never be excluded from another performative holiday dinner. I would never have to shrink myself down to make them feel larger. I had lost them completely and permanently, and it was the greatest gift I could have ever given myself. I stood alone on the balcony of my $4.5 million estate, breathing in the crisp, peaceful air of the lake. I was 33 years old. I was brilliant. I was successful, and I was wildly wealthy. The heavy, suffocating chains of the family scapegoat had been permanently shattered. For the first time in my entire life, looking out over the water I owned, I was completely, utterly free. When we grow up in an environment that constantly diminishes our value, we often fall into the dangerous trap of believing that if we just work harder or achieve more, we will finally earn the respect of our family. The story of the uninvited sister perfectly illustrates this painful reality. She spent her youth trying to prove her worth to parents who were completely committed to misunderstanding her. The tragic truth of a toxic family dynamic is that the rules are rigged and the goalposts are always moving. The favorite child will always be excused while the scapegoat will always take the blame regardless of reality. Recognizing that you can never win a rigged game is the very first and most difficult step toward achieving true personal liberation and lasting peace of mind. The most profound lesson we can take away from this journey is the incredible power of silent resilience. Instead of wasting her precious energy begging for a seat at a dining table where she was actively despised, the protagonist channeled all her focus inward. She built her financial empire in absolute secret. True independence does not need a captive audience. It does not require validation, applause, or permission from the exact people who tried their hardest to break your spirit. Financial and emotional autonomy are the absolute strongest shields a person can possibly forge in this life. By investing deeply in her own future, rather than feeding her family's fragile, demanding egos, she successfully created a magnificent sanctuary that nobody could ever take away from her. Furthermore, the story reveals a universal truth about bullies and abusers. Their power is almost always a complete illusion, built entirely on the forced compliance of their victims. The exact moment she stopped participating in their twisted narrative, their entire fabricated world collapsed in on itself. The family projected a desperate image of high society wealth, while secretly drowning in massive debt, whereas she embraced a highly practical, sensible lifestyle while accumulating genuine, lasting security. This teaches us a vital lesson. We must never measure our actual lived reality against someone else's carefully curated fake facade. The loudest and most arrogant people in the room are very often the most insecure, while quiet, consistent discipline yields undeniable concrete results. Finally, the narrative proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that walking away is never an act of surrender. It is the ultimate expression of profound self-respect. She did not need to scream, throw insults, or negotiate her boundaries. She simply presented the cold, unvarnished truth and let the natural consequences fall exactly where they belonged. Closing the front door on toxic family members is undeniably a heartbreaking decision, but it is the only way to make room for a life filled with genuine peace. You do not owe your hard-earned success or your safe sanctuary to the people who willingly cast you out into the storm. You owe it entirely to yourself to aggressively protect the beautiful life you built. Please share your own experiences with setting firm boundaries in the comments section below, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of personal healing and ultimate justice.